Thanks so much for joining us on what is, at least in Wales, another gorgeous day. And welcome to the first webinar of this mini-series, which is all about exploring the post-COVID landscape for climate action and has been made possible through the generous support of the European Climate Foundation and also all of my colleagues at Hope for the Future who've been really supportive in putting this event together. My name's Karina, I work at Hope for the Future, and my role is to manage the London office, which is the new office that we've recently established this year. And I coordinate the work that we do across London, the south of England and Wales. So for those of you who may not have come across Hope for the Future before, we're a climate change communications charity, and we exist to support individuals and groups across the UK to build relationships with politicians and to have more effective conversations with them about climate action and what they can be doing about climate change. Okay, so it goes without saying, and I'm sure we're all sick of hearing that these are unprecedented times, but that also means that we have now got unprecedented challenges to be dealing with. And so we're running this webinar series to provide a space and a forum for people to either begin to have or to continue to have climate conversations and conversations about climate action and moving forward on that, while more direct forms of engagement aren't really possible. So with that in mind, we've provided quite a broad topic for the discussion, and we hope that the rest of the conversation will be directed by your questions and the things you want to hear about from our panelists, and also by the interests of our panelists and what they will choose to talk about. Today's topic that we've come up with is, what does a just and sustainable international recovery from COVID look like? And joining us to share their ideas on this, we have three really fantastic panelists. We'll be hearing first from Dr. Andrew Harmer from the Global Health Policy Unit at Queen Mary University in London. And he's going to offer some reflections on sustainability and justice in global health and development, and then how that intersects with the current pandemic. We'll then hear from Mary Robinson, who is a former president of Ireland and chair of the Elders Foundation. And she'll be speaking to us about the injustices that are inherent in the climate crisis and how we can apply the lessons from responding to COVID to addressing those injustices and moving forward with meaningful climate action. And finally then, we will hear from Anna Yang, who is joining us from the Hoffman Centre for Sustainable Resource Economy at Chatham House. And she'll speak to us about the importance of building resilience into the international social, environmental and economic recovery that will follow on from the COVID crisis. In addition to those panellists, I'm also joined today by two of my lovely colleagues. We have Logan here, who is our research coordinator, and he'll be monitoring the questions that are in the Q&A to put them to our panelists. And Emma is our events officer, and she'll be monitoring the chat to respond to any comments that you have, any questions about Hope for the Future, and to resolve any technical difficulties. We hope that there won't be any, but if you do have any, do put that in the chat, and Emma will do her best to sort that for you. Before we get stuck into the discussion, which is what we're really all here for, just a brief bit of housekeeping from me. We will be recording this event, so you will be able to view it on demand on our YouTube channel, and we'll be sending out an email after this event with links for that at the end of the week. And we're also aiming to finish this by 3 o'clock, so we'll have around 30 minutes to hear from our speakers, and then we'll have around 20 minutes with your questions. And then when you leave this webinar, you will be directed to a feedback form, and there's absolutely no pressure to fill it in, but if you could, and you do have the time and inclination to do that, that'd be really helpful and will help us to improve our events in the future. So finally, if you have questions for our panelists, please do ask them using the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And if you don't have questions, do still keep an eye on that. You can upvote questions and we're more likely to see them, and Logan will be able to put them to the panelists if he's seen them there. And also feel free to use the chat function to communicate with other attendees for any general discussion about this webinar or about any networking that you want to do in that place. Please feel free to use that. Okay, that's all from me. So I'm going to hand right over to our first speaker, and that is Andrew. So please take it away, Andrew.
Okay. Hi, hi everybody. Yep, I'm Andrew Harmer. I work at Queen Mary University of London, and I direct one of only two undergraduate global health programs in the UK. So he studied global health for 3 years at Queen Mary with a great bunch of academics working on global health, COVID, pandemics, climate change, and all of the non-health factors that shape good and bad health globally. So suddenly finding myself in the middle of things and trying to make sense of everything, just like everybody else. I have to confess, over the weekend, I've been watching all of the events in the United States, in Minnesota, and also, the latest developments on COVID-19 in the UK and what the government is doing. And I honestly don't have an awful lot of hope right now. So I'm hoping that contributing to this webinar may give me some hope. So I'm really interested to hear from the other panelists, and also just the people that are tuned in to listen. I mean, it's an adage which I picked up from Extinction Rebellion. And I'm a supporter of Extinction Rebellion, have been for a couple of years. And one of the phrases that sticks in my mind is that when hope dies, action begins. And I guess that is as true now as it was previously. And I guess as we go forward, we probably have to keep that in mind, not rely too much on hope, but focus on action. And I'll end my short presentation on that. But one observation, I think, I don't think we're going to have a just recovery from COVID-19. The way that it's impacting already, and it's discriminating against people of colour. So, you're 2.5 times as likely to die from COVID-19 as people of white ethnicity. And the way that it's impacting on people in low wage, precarious employment, who have to work all hours of the day just to make ends meet, exposing themselves more than others. So it's already impacting negatively, and we aren't going to have a just recovery because of that. So we have to kind of accept that and think about ways that we can create a just and sustainable society, so that when we have to face future pandemics, the response is going to be more just and more sustainable than it has been at the moment. So that's my general initial observation. I guess the main point that I want to make, and it's really difficult to go into any detail in just 8 minutes, but the main point, I think, is that if we do want a just and sustainable future per se, so we need to go upstream. It's not really enough to just try to reform our way out of a crisis. We have to go upstream to the top and find out which structures in our society are problematic. And I think there are 3 broad structures that we really need to get a grip on if we're going to have any kind of just or sustainable future. I suppose the first one I would focus on is cultural. So I've already alluded to the racism that we are seeing in the United States at the moment. But also, I think it's really important to recognize that we live in a patriarchal society with deeply ingrained gender inequality. And the negative health consequences of that are really well understood. And we can see it playing out in the lockdown at the moment. But generally, I mean, pandemics or epidemics tend to render women invisible. In the case of Ebola, for example, in 2014, more women died of obstetric complications than of the disease itself. But that statistic is, I mean, how many people know of that statistic? So epidemics, pandemics can render women invisible, or they can expose patriarchy in society. So that would be the first structure that I think we need to look at. The second, I guess, obviously, is economic. And I think you can divide that into economic justice and economic sustainability. And I think if you wanted to go through some of the things that are impacting negatively in terms of economic justice, you would need a global society that recognized the importance of cancelling debt, the amount of money that less developed countries are paying in investment, interest returns to wealthy countries is astronomical. I mean, since the 1980s, least developed countries have probably paid back to wealthy countries in the tune of $4 trillion. So we need to focus on debt cancellation. We need to focus on tax justice, get rid of tax havens. Zuckerman's analysis in the Hidden Wealth of Nations calculates maybe $7.5 trillion is hidden away in tax havens. I mean, that's completely ridiculous. And I guess we just need to have a redistributive economy where the wealth of a very tiny percentage of the population, their wealth is redistributed more fairly. If we look at economic sustainability, I mean, it's pretty obvious, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But as David Attenborough famously said, anyone who thinks you can have infinite growth on a finite planet is either a madman or an economist. We cannot sustain our current consumption levels. We just can't. So we need to look at different ways of consuming, different ways of financing, different ways of living. And I would be advocating a degrowth approach, which we can talk about later. I think the final point I want to make is the political structure. One of the things that is really obvious about the pandemic is that it really matters which government is in power. There are two notable governments, the UK and the US, that are making all the wrong decisions right now in response to the pandemic. So it's really important that you have a progressive government in power, or at least one that is open to the possibilities for a different society. But I think in terms of the future, what does a future recovery look like? Well, actually, the future is not something in the distance. It's the future which is right outside your doorstep. It's really about what you're prepared to do. I can give you a long bucket list of things that I think I would like a future society would be. But how we get there is the missing bit that never comes up in conversation. So unless you're prepared to do something, we're never going to have that future. Okay, so I think really the future for a just and sustainable recovery really is just outside your doorstep, and it's entirely down to you what the contours of that future look like. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts with us, Andrew. That's really insightful. And just a quick question before we move on. We spoke a couple of weeks ago, we had a series about communicating the climate crisis in the media. I apologise, there's a helicopter going over just now. And one of the speakers for that pointed out that scientists are the most trusted communicators by the public in respect of the climate crisis. And so do you see that there's a role for, say, public health professionals in communicating the climate crisis? And can we learn anything from the way that the pandemic has been communicated for moving forward with that?
Yeah, totally. Actually, I mean, there are lots of studies which show that the most trusted member of society that people generally have contact with is your GP. And so if you can integrate climate messaging into general GP practice, making links for people who maybe hadn't considered links before. I mean, nobody wants to have information rammed down their throats, and if it's introduced into general conversation by somebody that you trust, like a GP, then that can be really powerful. Health as a general tool for positive messages, it's extremely it's extremely effective. And there have been studies to show that if you give somebody a piece of paper with a description on it, and you ask them to pull out the most positive messages, they'll always pull out the health messages. So if you can frame climate change in terms of how it will benefit your health, then that's a great way, I think, to frame climate action.
Wow, that's really, really useful to know. Thank you. I think we're going to move on to hear from Mary now, if you're ready, Mary.
Yes, thank you. And hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be involved with an organization which describes itself as hope for the future. Because when you mentioned that I was chair of the elders now, and when the elders were brought together by Nelson Mandela in 2007 to be independent, to be humble, but to give leadership on human rights and peace, he said to us, and above all, bring hope. So I have to recognize that that's part of what I'm mandated, if you like, to do. And yet, last January, I was close to despair. I was hiding it because I didn't want people to, take from me that I wasn't hopeful, but I wasn't, because it was the start of 2020. And I didn't see any real willingness by governments in particular, and by an awful lot of companies, with some few exceptions, to make the dramatic, ambitious changes to bring us in line with what the scientists had told us in October 2018, when they interpreted what the Paris Climate Agreement meant. What does it mean to be well below 2 degrees and working for 1.5 degrees? The scientists said, no, actually the whole world has to stay at 1.5 degrees or below. And this is because otherwise we won't have a future. And we have to reduce by 45% carbon emissions by 2030. And that would be 10 years from January. It's less than 10 years now. And so, thinking about the COP that was supposed to come in November, the Conference on Climate in Glasgow, I was thinking to myself, what will it take? Now, I would never have wished a COVID-19 on our world, but it has certainly turned things upside down. And it has broken a system of what we call business as usual. And I'll come back to that, because actually business as usual was not serving us well, either in leading to a climate cliff, becoming extinct, basically, an existential threat, but also the inequality in our world. And I agree with Andrew that COVID-19 has in fact exacerbated the inequalities that existed before, and the links between those inequalities, the way in which we have to look at poverty, gender, being a migrant, being a woman, being a person with disability, being indigenous. All of those are layers of literally of discrimination and of prejudice and of hardship. And they are exacerbated. And being in an abusive household where you're locked down, being a girl out of school in so many parts of the world, forced now into child marriage, all kinds of exacerbations of COVID-19. But I want to come to the positives in a moment. But before I do it, I think I'd like to explain the climate justice that I have been working on for the last 15, 16 years, because it begins with the injustice of climate change. And I've been able to understand now at least 5 layers of that injustice, and there are probably more. So let me just set those out briefly. The first layer is that climate change affects the poorest countries and poorest communities because they're in the wrong parts of the world, near the equator, etc., or small island states in the ocean. It affects them disproportionately. And that's how I came to climate change. I'm not a scientist, but I was working on human rights in African countries. And I saw what I didn't see in Europe or in Ireland, where I'm based. I saw the disproportionate impacts and the unfairness that the poor farmers couldn't predict what was happening and were so affected. The second injustice, the second layer of injustice, is the gender dimension. Because women in societies have different social roles, they have different power. Women tend to lack power, they tend to lack land rights, they tend to lack access to credit or access to training in agricultural skills, etc. And therefore, it's harder, and yet they're the ones that have to put food on the table and go further in the drought for water, etc. The third injustice is the one that children, in their millions, under Greta Thunberg, have reminded us of, the intergenerational injustice. And I'm so grateful to them for that. The fourth layer is one we don't think about, I think, much at all, but it's very important. And that is the injustice of the different pathways to development. The industrialized world developed on fossil fuel. And now we're trying to wean ourselves off fossil fuel because we must, and go green in so many different ways, and have green jobs, etc. Developing countries before Paris, and I know this because I was the special envoy of the UN Secretary General before Paris, they committed in their nationally determined contributions, as they were called, their promises, what they would do following the Paris Agreement. They promised to go as green as possible, but they said, but we will need the investment, we will need the skills, we will need the training, and they haven't really had that support. And meanwhile, a significant number of developing countries have been finding coal, and in particular oil and gas, in their territory. So what are they to do? They need to bring their people out of poverty. But if they go the wrong route, we will not have a safe world in the future because we'll hit that ceiling that the scientists have been warning us about. So that's another injustice that we have to address. And we need to do far more to help developing countries. The fifth injustice, which is huge, is our injustice towards Mother Nature. What we're doing to biodiversity, what we're doing to extinction of species, what we're doing to the very ecosystems that sustain us, how stupid we've been over the years in thinking that we somehow are separate from nature. No, we're not. We're absolutely holistically involved with nature, as indigenous peoples have always understood. Okay, so they're the 5 layers of injustice that lead me to wanting climate justice. What has COVID-19 taught us? A number of things. First of all, that human behavior collectively can matter hugely. It's the only thing that's safeguarding us from this virus for which we don't have a vaccine. It's our ability and willingness to comply with social distancing, lockdown, washing our hands, all of that behavior, which is different, dramatically different. We need to remember this when we come out as consumers, for example. What are we going to do as thoughtful consumers in the future, collectively, to help to address the other crisis, which is looming urgently on us, the climate crisis? Secondly, we've learned that science matters. We've listened, and Andrew made this point about GPs, but it's true of all the health experts. Governments have been listening to them and developing their policy on the basis of them. But we weren't listening to the climate scientists. We weren't listening when they kept telling us, you've got to reduce by 45% carbon emissions by 2030. And nowhere was I seeing that ambition. Now I hope we will listen to the science. Another thing, government matters. We're actually seeing that government matters hugely. We're seeing it because we will be able to track the governments that delayed for various reasons, didn't pay attention to the science, or were ambitious for their own narcissistic reasons, let's put it that way, and didn't take the action that's necessary. And it will be cruel in terms of deaths and illness disproportionately in those populations. And I disagree with Andrew about one thing. COVID has made women visible as leaders. Women-led countries are doing well. From Angela Merkel in Germany to the prime ministers of Norway, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, the president of Taiwan. They took tough decisions based on the advice they got. They brought their people with them in a trusted way because they were determined to pay attention to what their people cared about. And they have done better. So that's a good thing. There's another thing that I think will be important in the future, and that is we have seen compassion breaking out. We're seeing all over the world, and I'm seeing it here in Ireland, I know it's happening all over the world, neighborliness, helping those more in suffering, helping food parcels, helping to provide even the cooperation between scientists as part of that to get a vaccine and make that vaccine available. So this cooperation, solidarity, compassion is a hugely important and has been missing in the climate space. When I used to talk about climate justice and talk about small island states, indigenous peoples, poor countries, people would look at me and say, oh, but that's not me. We couldn't see the other. We couldn't express for the other. So I do believe that we can learn a lot in our thoughtful spaces now. We need to come out of this with focus on a Green New Deal and green jobs, biodiversity and nature-based solutions, just transition for the workers in coal, oil and gas. They mustn't be left behind. And a spirit of empathy for developing countries that helps us to help them to bring themselves out of poverty so that we have a more equal world. So suddenly, out of this, although I know COVID is very hard, tough, deadly, terrible, I am more hopeful now than I was in January, because our business as usual, which was not bringing us to the right place, is broken. Can we build back better? Can we come out of this more positively? And I love a sentence that Kofi Annan uses, that you're never too young to lead and you're never too old to learn.
Wow, thank you so much, Mary. Thank you for articulating those thoughts about the injustice of it so articulately. I think that's something that many of us try to do and probably fall very short of what we just heard. So I really appreciate that. Just briefly, before we move on, obviously those injustices are really, really deeply entrenched, and dismantling centuries of systemic and institutionalized inequality will rightly take time and sensitivity to be done right. What would be your message to the people who say that the climate and ecological crisis is so urgent we don't have time to deal with that?
My message is that we have to come out of this recognizing, if you like, that there's the COVID health wave, there's behind that the economic wave, and behind that again, but very urgent, is the crisis of climate. 3 waves that we have to sort of deal with together. And we have to deal with them together in meaning everything we do has to say our recovery has to be completely compatible with meeting the targets that the scientists have told us are the only way to a future. And therefore, I want us to think in terms of a whole of government approach to doing this in every country, but a whole of community approach, so that local communities, young people, women, business also feel an ownership of how we come out of this. If we try to just sort of bump back to business as usual, we will have failed to use this crisis. And we are told, never waste a very serious crisis. We mustn't waste the fact that we have been enabled to be different because the other system is now broken.
Absolutely, absolutely, thank you. I'd love to hear from Anna now, if you're ready.
Yeah, I'm ready. Well, thank you, Mary. It will be really difficult to follow your act now. I wanted to make sort of 3 big points, and then elaborate within them. So I think one is sort of linking COVID and climate, which both Andrew and you, Mary, talked about. Then touch on recovery discussion, and then building on recovery for what. So those are the 3. And so I think both Andrew and Mary talked about the inequality and and I agree that where I think of COVID as, a shock to the system, and it exposed and exacerbates how the current structures that Andrew talked about, they're no longer fit for purpose. I mean, we've been living through it, but I think I was having a conversation at some point with a colleague, which is like, the analogy would be the tide has come out and then we know who doesn't have pants on. So in a way, it's just like basically tells us what are the things that right now, because of our economic structure, because of more entrenched systems that we have been building on the last couple of decades, that they're no longer fit and that we need to kind of change them. And I think what also COVID provides is there are many accelerations and crises that was underlying, and we can see the interlinkages for them. But I do think that the interesting thing about COVID is it does provide opportunity for us to think about a different world and a different future. And so some of the similarities between COVID and climate, Mary touched upon, which is it is affecting the most vulnerable and the poor. It highlights the inequality issues, and it is global. It ignores the border. And I do actually think that what also, for me, it really highlighted the role of cities. Because in a way, COVID is a disease which is relying on the connectivity and density of cities. And also we see what some of the mayors and cities are doing when they responded to climate change, and then now how they're responding to COVID. And there's some of the, some cities like Milan, they're using this as an opportunity for them to sort of roll out different plans so that you can have a better urban planning, better transit systems. I think the second similarity is around the interlinkages. So we know, there are studies that saying that the greenhouse gas reduction that happened in the last couple of months, I mean, there are various models, but there's a number that I like to, it varies from 3 to 13%, but the number that I like to imagine, I'll just pick a number given any assumptions, is like, it's about 8% reduction compared to 2019. It's a good number. It's not enough, obviously, if we think about the net zero by, that we have to achieve by 2020, and we have to peak by, net zero by 2050, and then we have to peak by 2020. This is just what we're going through now is almost like a dry run of the collective action that's required, multiple level, from government to cities to citizens, that we need to mobilize to prepare for climate emergency. And I think the interlinkages also talks about like what one country does affect another country. I mean, obviously, Andrew touches about the debt issue, but also from the supply chain perspective, right? We talk about trade, and also either we're going to have a further trade or retrenchment of trade. All the geopolitics, what is playing out, will really, really, it just highlights all these interlinkages between us. The rise of the health agenda, obviously, but I think from a climate change perspective, how do we highlight the co-benefit angle? Right, we know from what are the lessons learned we can do from the air quality campaigns that are actually, accelerating some of the closure of coal power plants. Can we do the same thing with food, right? Can we do sort of using health and diet as a way for us to accelerate the transition in the food system? So I think there are different ways that we can think about the how do we sort of increase the health agenda so that we can accelerate transition. And obviously what is in everybody's mind, and Mary touched on this, is the role of nature. And obviously, this whole issue about zoonotic disease, I can never say this word, which is sort of how do you spread the germ that you spread between animals and people. And as we're losing nature, as we have deforestation in Brazil, what does that mean? And even if the science between the connection of deforestation and more the rise of epidemic is still evolving, but I think in terms of how it captures the imagination of the general public between the connection of nature and climate change really matters. But also in the urban context, we all talk about better air quality, that you can hear the birds, people hearing like bells that they didn't even know that you can help. There was a church near them because of all the pollution noises. So that's sort of around climate change. And then now we also know that if we follow the news and media, people are talking about recovery, right? How do you bail out key industries? There's a very hot debate around bailing out the air travel industry. And obviously the bailout approach should vary for high income countries and low income countries. How do we make sure that for the short term, we protect the most vulnerable people working on small and medium enterprises, how they guarantee their jobs. But I actually think that it also provides an opportunity for us to think about how do we address a deeper issue around gig economy and sharing economy, right? These are sort of evolutions that are happening with our economic system that we never actually properly addressed. And this is the opportunity for us to, when we think about recovery plan, how do we provide better social protection systems for these new types of job? And for the longer term recovery plan, obviously we're talking about conditioning. You know, there are lots of initiatives that different countries are doing. And obviously there are countries that are they're using the recovery green plan to move forward on some of the green agenda, like what France is doing. I mean, some of you will know about, you know, the automotive that France has deployed on the automotive recovery plan, but also, you know, the conditional requirement that the French government asked for the Air France, their 7 billion bailout. If you're interested, Google it. It's really interesting. And also what South Korea is doing. So you have like a couple of countries that are using this as great opportunity, while their countries, I have to sigh, where I come from a developing country. I come from Brazil. And I look at my government, I look at my president, that I didn't vote for, what he's doing, and people using this as an opportunity to sort of roll back on environmental policies. So I think where, you know, what we need to support, where we need to move, is to send a message that we need to connect the recovery to green, conditional to, you know, all the green, sustainable, climate-friendly policies. And I think the more important thing is how do we ensure that it delivers for all, right? Because I think what we have learned is that we can't exacerbate. I mean, what COVID-19 showed us about the issue of inequality across developed countries and developing countries. So finally, what I want to make the point is around recovery for what? And this is it's an evolving research question that we have at Chatham House. And I'll talk a little bit about Chatham House, which is, I think the COVID-19 brings the issue about resilience back in my mind, which is like, we have as a society need to become more resilient. And resilient from across a broader concept of climate resilience, but also how can you be more resilient? It's like how you have a more integrated framework to think about resiliency that touches on the social angle, that touches on economic angle, that touches on cultural angle. We are sort of, you know, different research teams at Chatham House are looking at how countries and regions and sectors have been responding to COVID, and then can we harvest lessons learned so that we can build a more integrated resilient system, so that we can be better prepared for future shocks. And so that as we're building new infrastructures, whether they're like buildings and cities or even social infrastructures, they're better prepared for, you know, knowing that the future is going to be more turbulent. And obviously the nature-based solution everybody's talking about provides a lot. I will use that as an example, that it delivers multiple wins, because it delivers, you know, you can deliver jobs, you can deliver co-benefit, but also, you know, examples in Southeast Asia where that it actually provides coastal areas for better protection against flooding, it's cheaper. So there are different ways that we can think about resilience, climate resilience, that kind of touches on the interlinkages, but also it delivers all the different social, economic, and cultural angle of it. So that's my final point about resilience. And my final point about, you know, looking into the future, I am an optimist by nature. Otherwise, I wouldn't be working on climate change, because otherwise, for climate change activists, like everything you do feels like hopeless, because it's a constant battle that is trying to stop, you know, a disaster happening. And I do like to think that, you know, to reinforce what Mary's saying, that the crisis that we're going through is obviously horrendous. But how do we use this crisis as an opportunity for us to elevate our thinking, to see where there are cracks in the system that are no longer fit for purpose, so we can go in as change agents and crack that, you know, open up that crack and implement different kind of thinking, different kind of innovation. So this is what I would like us to come out of this webinar to think about. It's like, obviously things are really grim. Obviously we have a bigger challenge, you know, once we survive COVID, how do we plan for climate change? But I also want us to use this as an opportunity for us to think of, you know, to be creative and bold and be more imaginative about a different future. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thanks for making those extra points there. So actually, one thing I'd be really interested in returning to that you mentioned was about the urban and city leadership, actually. And it's just got me thinking that we're looking obviously at international problems, but do you think perhaps it's time to be turning to different models of governance and looking for leadership elsewhere? And should we be supporting leadership at a level that is not necessarily on national governments and at this time?
Absolutely. I agree with Mary that there is a role for national governments to play, for sure. But I do think that we do need bottom-up governance and different kind of innovation across. And I do think that you can have change agents everywhere, right? You can have change agents in existing formalized structure. You can have change agents within informal networks, and you can have change agents at some national levels that are city. I mean, we do think that, I mean, in the run up to Paris with C40 and what governments, what city mayors have done through, you know, global compact mayors and all of that, they already showed that they can deliver different kind of innovation. And I do think that there's a lot of lessons learned. I think we're still I think that the COVID crisis is still unfolding, right? So from where we're standing as research organization, we're still seeing how different cities are responding and whether they are in the midst of still managing the crisis, but some of them are already using this as an opportunity to introduce different kind of measures. So I do think that I want to make a big shout out for city as a place where, because I do think that city is where a lot of innovations touch the ground, because we live in cities, right? The majority of the population, more than 50%, like, well, moving forward, even in 2050, you know, the majority of the population will be living in cities. Although with COVID, who knows, with this demographic dynamic may change. But I do believe that city has, you know, a closer look, and this is where we would want to do more research on this, which is like what cities can do, what kind of policy that they can deliver, that can deliver multiple benefits, including sustainability, including social dimension, and also provide like better economic opportunities. So, yeah.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you all of you for your contributions so far. At this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Logan, who's been diligently monitoring the question and answers, and I can see that we've got some really interesting questions coming through. So thankfully, it's not my job to sort through them and make decisions about that, but I will let Logan do that for us now.
Right. Yes, thank you. So yeah, I've been enjoying listening to these really captivating bits that you've been saying, and also at the same time trying to follow the myriad of questions that have been coming in. We've had a particular rush towards the end, but I'm going to start off with a question that's directed mainly towards Andrew, I think, but others can also, I think, jump in as well. Which is, so the question is from Rachel Trihani, and she said, and it's just moved up and down in the chat, and she says, Andrew, you mentioned XR. What is the role for public protest, civil disobedience for climate action in a post-COVID mid-recession world?
Great, I'm so glad you asked that question. Obviously, you know, we know that, yes, what's the day today? Monday? I completely lost track of the days. So, you know, we know that on Saturday, 15 XR protesters were arrested for their socially distanced protests in Westminster Square. So they were 4 meters away from each other and were simply standing up with placards. And the police just came in and arrested them. Yesterday, we saw the Black Lives Matters protest in Trafalgar Square. Thousands of people were congregating and protesting in a more traditional way. Many of them were not respecting social distancing. And it's generating a very important discussion right now about what do we do in terms of XR and climate protest. I think we have to recognize the fact that the climate crisis is upon us. And if we wait until COP26, we will have missed an entire year's worth of demonstration. So we have to start demonstrating in some way immediately. I'm not sure what the best way to do that is. But if we do relax the lockdown in the UK, then I think we need to start thinking creatively about more direct action in a respectful way, which is a way which is publicly acceptable. It's very difficult at the moment because on the one hand we are constrained by what we can do, and we just have to get the messaging right. And it may be that what is required, and I think this is the most important thing in the response to the pandemic, is to have as open and public a discussion as possible, bringing in as many people as possible. So yeah, I was very disappointed that the police arrested the 15 protesters, and I can only imagine that those kind of climate protests will become more visible and more frequent as we move into the next few months.
Yeah, good. I think so. I think one of the things that's worth noting here is, no matter how many people you have on board out there campaigning for climate action, you're always going to have a certain. It's probable that we'll always have a certain amount of vested interests who are reluctant to change and would perhaps oppose this. And I think, which I'm gonna direct this question towards Anna, if that's okay, because we have a question from Garth Wilkinson, who said, how do we overcome the enormous pressure from vested interests to get back to business as usual?
My God, that's a really big question. And this is where we think, a lot from a Chatham House perspective, from the political economy lens. And I do think that, again, you're talking to an optimist. I think even within the conversations that we have with the business community, and obviously some like oil majors, they do, through this climate transition, there isn't a real role for them to play in the future, while there are other businesses that actually there's a role for them to play. So I think it's important for us to unpack like who's some of the winners and the losers in the transition process. But even within that, right, I think within that, how do we understand the different dynamics so that in specific supply chain? So it's really necessary to sort of unpack the different levels for the climate transition, who are the winners and the losers, and within that, some of the key sectors. And I do think that ultimately, finance does have a role to play. We can see the enormous sort of amount of, at least the perception about how climate is a real risk when Mark Carney kind of put out that report on the run-up to Paris and really shifted the conversation around finance. And obviously, finance was not going to deal with the political problem. It does send a signal that you unveil some of the different layers of vested interest that has on it, that sort of gets covered in this discussion. So for where we, from a research perspective, where we're looking at, we're always trying to unpack who wins and who loses. And within the losers, I would imagine that, can you sort of do a bit of divide and conquer? But hey, that is sort of what we're trying to do. I mean, just using the example of some of the discussion that I'm involved in Brazil as well. So people sort of, to stop deforestation, even within the agricultural sector in Brazil, some of them actually want to export and they want to implement good environmental policies because they think it's as an access to markets issue, while some of them aren't exactly, because they don't need to export, and so they are motivated by different kind of thing. But we need to be able to have more sophistication when we're analyzing the vested interest, so that you can also break the sector up, right?
Mm. Yeah, I'm really, I'm also really glad that you sort of brought in some of those international aspects to it as well, because I think quite often we tend to focus on that debate within nations rather than across them, which is, I think, also a really good time to bring in Mary again. So we have a question which goes, so based on your own experience at the UN, do you think the organization has the capacity to provide the necessary international leadership to tackle the COVID and climate crises?
Again, good question. We're seeing more doubt about that in this context of a world where we see quite a lot of populism, putting countries first, nationalism, and somehow disparaging the multilateral system. Well, speaking from the perspective of the elders, we've just adopted a policy paper where we strongly defend, more than ever, the multilateral system, because the threats actually are really very serious now. We've been talking about the climate crisis, but the nuclear crisis is also another huge threat. And the COVID pandemic would be much better addressed if we actually strengthened the WHO, not tried to defund it, which President Trump was doing, and criticized it in narrow terms. The UN is not, and I know this from the inside, is not a perfect system. I used to say when I was High Commissioner for Human Rights that, in the words of Winston Churchill, the United Nations is the worst system except for all the others. That was what he said about democracy. And, if we didn't have the United Nations, we would have to reinvent it immediately. We can always improve it. And in particular, we should improve the Security Council, which is a long-running thorn in the side of the reputation of the United Nations. But we do need the multilateral system, and we need regions to take their responsibility. For example, the European Union, I hope, will be a leader now on not just a Green Deal plan, but also a green biodiversity plan, and the funding to help countries to make that transition. All of this is for discussion at the moment, but it's good that the EU is trying to give that leadership. Other regions also need to give regional leadership. It's not, the UN can give a global and almost more normative, the values of what we need to do. Yes, it leads on the COP on climate and the COP on biodiversity, which was to have taken place this year, is now postponed also to next year. Those two need to be brought closer together. We need to have a sense that it's the one issue that we're talking about, and then we have the framework that the UN supported and that countries adopted. And it's a framework not to be forgotten. I was the special envoy of the Secretary General at the time on climate change in September 2015. And I watched as 193 countries agreed the 2030 agenda with its 17 sustainable development goals. And I wear this badge as much as possible. I don't know whether we can see it on my thing. It's a beautiful badge of the UN because it goes with everything. It's multicolored and it symbolizes the 2030 agenda with its 17 sustainable development goals. That is the framework going forward. That is what we need to get countries, companies, cities, communities all aligned to. We need to remove subsidies on fossil fuel. We need to put a proper price on carbon. Those are the things we need. But under that kind of leadership of the UN, yes, I think we can get to where we need to. And that's not to say that there isn't room for improvement.
That's really good and really strengthening. I think we've got time for a couple more questions, and I think it would be good to get a little snapshot of everyone if possible, if you want to speak out on it, because I think because we have a question from Finn, who's got a question about gender equality, which I think is something that came up to some degree, I think, in all of your contributions. So I'm just going to read that out, and one of you can jump in. So on gender injustice, more women than men lost jobs over COVID, and the government has suspended gender pay gap reporting this year because of COVID, effectively endorsing discrimination because of COVID. How do we make sure this crisis isn't leveraged to expose the most vulnerable here in the UK?
I think we're all being polite, but I'll jump in if I must, even though it's referencing the UK. There's no doubt that there are a lot of discriminations. We have found in Ireland, for example, that in the support for staying in work, they forgot about women who became pregnant and dropped out because of childbearing, and coming back in, they weren't covered. That's now being addressed. But you know, all of these issues are there. The COVID-19 has just exacerbated these inequalities, as I think all three of us have kind of said. We cannot have a world of such inequality. That's the point. And people have been thinking about this, I think, in their homes. They've gone back to fundamental values, even the values of who are the workers who matter most in a crisis. They are the care workers and the health workers and the low-paid essential cleaners in hospitals, etc. Many, many of these jobs are held by women, and they have been disregarded low-paid jobs up to now. Maybe that too has to be addressed. The abuse of households, where we are seeing from those who deal with sexual violence and violence in the home, you know, a huge, you know, growth in problems. So yes, let's be more thoughtful, and let's use the opportunity to increase that sense of gender equality, and including the women leaders, as I said, who've done well. Why don't we have gender balanced cabinets, gender balanced companies, gender balanced right across the board as we come out?
Can I just contribute to that one? So yeah, I think there's a few points to follow up on. I do agree with Mary completely. Kate Rayworth's Donut Economics, she makes the very important point that work within the household doesn't feature as a factor in economic calculations. The voluntary sector doesn't feature, and these areas are still dominated, occupied predominantly by women, and their work is simply not reflected in the economic model that we have at the moment. So bring that into our economy, and also more generally, have an economy which does not support, as David Graeber called it in his book, bullshit jobs. We don't need an economy that rests on those, and we do need an economy that rests on all of the important jobs that we are beginning to recognise are important right now. We don't need jobs that are based in the city on finance, which benefit a very tiny percentage of the population. But we do need jobs that benefit everywhere, everyone, that are essentially public goods. So we should have an economy that prioritises those and degrows the others.
Yeah. I don't know if Anna, do you want to contribute that, or should we go to the next question?
I think we should go to the next one.
Okay, good. So I think I'm sort of looking at Karina a little bit just to check that we've got time for a quick bullet point answer. One, good. And I'm gonna throw this open to the three of you again. So it's a top-rated question from Sarah. What can UK citizens do to uphold climate justice as a core message of COP26 next year?
Well, I'll start if you like again. And I think it's important that the UK has taken the leadership of COP26. And that means something. It means something not just for the government. It means something for the people of the UK. And I think, you know, you really have to make sure that it's a people-centered climate justice approach, because we will have learned the lessons of COVID, because we're in a much different place. And we must insist that that place makes the ambitious difference in the climate commitments that we need, and at the same time a recovery that is just and fair and green?
While our actions are restricted at the moment, take advantage of that time to simply write to your MPs and just say, look, I still think that climate is an extremely important issue, and I want to know what you're going to do about it. When the lockdown is relaxed and we are able to circulate in society more easily, we should start demonstrating. We should start demonstrating and making sure that we keep this issue right at the very top of the political agenda.
I want to say that the citizens can put pressure on the government across different levels of government that we need to continue to show leadership. I think UK has shown leadership in many occasions. We had come up with the 2050 net zero. So it is our job to keep on pushing so that we continue to show leadership. And I think COP is the way as well, right? You have multilateral negotiation for us, but we can also demonstrate leadership in so many other sectors.
Good, thank you very much. So that's the end of our questions, and I'm now going to hand back over to Karina.
Thank you, Logan, and thank you all so much for engaging so fully with those questions. And I know there were so many more, and I'm really sad to actually have to wrap this up now because it's been a fantastic discussion, and I would happily spend my whole afternoon continuing to discuss this with you. But we did say an hour, and we're just slightly running over, so we will call it a day for now. And I'd just like to say thank you again to our really, really fantastic speakers and for all of the insights that you've shared with us today. And thank you to everyone who's joined as an attendee as well. Thank you for bringing all those questions and engaging so well with the discussion. And I really hope that you've taken something from this and you can then bring that perhaps into conversations that you'll continue to have at home and with your wider networks and the people that you know. And yeah, really continue those conversations. Yeah, and if you're interested in continuing with a slightly different discussion, but that's still quite relevant, we've got a webinar tomorrow where we'll be discussing UK political leadership on the climate crisis. And we'll be doing that with the crossbench peer Baroness Bryony Worthington. We'll have the former Environmental Audit Committee Chair Mary Cray, and we'll have the former Lord Mayor of Bristol, Cleo Lake, and they'll be joining us tomorrow to discuss that. And that's starting at 10 AM tomorrow. So if you're interested in that, please join us at 10 AM tomorrow for that. And as many of our panelists said today, just now, continue to engage with your MPs, even now. So if you need to get in touch with us to help you do that, we're really happy to do that. And we've also just recently launched a virtual lobbying guide, which is on our website. So have a read through that. And if you want any more help, we're very happy to hear from you. Yeah, and now if you could take a minute at the end now to just fill in the feedback form if you have time, that would be fantastic. And we really hope to see you again over the next few days for the next few webinars. But yeah, thank you for sharing the afternoon with us. It's been fantastic.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to our panelists. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.